the majority of those bills that revolve around gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination and so on, those have been filed by folks who are advocates for LGBT plus QIA rights, and they are trying to incorporate into current Chapter 21 of the Texas Labor Code statutory protection against discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation or similar characteristics. Some are broad spectrum, others are not so broad spectrum, but that's the general trend of things, and quite a lot of those.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, and this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. Every 2 years, the Texas Legislature convenes for a 140-day regular legislative session, and the 2023 session starts on January 10th. For those of you looking at your calendar about now, we're recording this episode on January 4th for release on January 12th. Hopefully nothing too drastic happens in the intervening week, but now you know. While legislators' main job is to agree on Texas' budget for the next 2 years, they also sort through thousands of proposed laws affecting all areas of life in Texas, including employment. Joining me today to discuss the legislative process and preview how the 88th Texas Legislature might affect employers are my friends Tommy Simmons and Matt Abel. Tommy Simmons serves as legal counsel for Commissioner Aaron Demerson, the employer representative on the Texas Workforce Commission. But to Texas business leaders, he's recognized as one of the state's leading authorities on employment-related legislation and the one guy in state government we can trust for straightforward guidance on Texas and federal employment laws. He authored the TWC book, especially for Texas employers, and is the assistant editor of the Texas Association of Businesses Employment Law Handbook. And Matt Abel is the vice president for policy at the Texas Association of Business, the state's Chamber of Commerce. He serves as the primary staff member for healthcare and employment relations issues at TAB. Prior to his current position, he was the chief of staff for Texas State Representative John Frullo. He has extensive experience in the legislative and regulatory process. In full disclosure, I just ended 4 years as an officer of TAB, where I continue to serve on the board of directors. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Matt and Tommy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Excited to be here.
So let's start, Tommy, with just kind of an overview of the legislative calendar in Texas. I mean, we only meet every other year, so we're quasi safe on the even years. But even during the even years, we've got interim committees and all of that, and then we have pre-billing, filing, and all those things. Would you kind of just go through that eternal cycle of getting ready for the legislature and then actually executing it?
That's right. Just a very quick overview, and then I'll be glad to share highlights of what bills have been pre-filed so far. Now, every session, in the run-up to every session, which usually begins in the first or second week of January every 2 years, there is a pre-filing period that usually begins in mid-November, and this year was no different. The first date for pre-filing bills was November the 14th of 2022. And already on that date, we saw close to 1,000 bills filed in both the House and the Senate. And one thing that I do in Commissioner Demerson's office every session is I keep track of all the bills that are filed and keep a list of all the employment-related legislation and workforce-related legislation that is filed, and any agency-related legislation that will affect how the agency does business with employers. So I was already on the first day of filing, I was keeping track, and just to let everybody know, I keep a list, and it's not a great big secret. I keep a list of employment law related bills every session. I've been doing that since 2003. And those lists are available to Texas employers. Anybody who wants one, all you have to do is, write to me at my email address of Tommy.Simmons, Simmons, at twc.texas, all spelled out, .gov, Gov, and request a copy of that list. I also share the list on a regular basis with our partners in business and workforce development and employment law, the Texas Association of Business. I share that list with certain folks over there at TAB, and you can also write to them and ask if they have a copy of my bill tracking file that they could send you, and you're welcome to it. So just let me know if you want a copy of this. But basically, you've got a pre-filing period, and it's still going on. I'm keeping track of it every day. I get reports coming out from various legislative tracking databases, and the first day of the session is going to be January the 10th. And of course, there's a lot of swearing in that goes on, and other procedural actions that go on about that. And there's it's still not exactly certain what the map is going to look like in terms of committee chairmanships and so on. But the Speaker of the Texas House is going to have a very pivotal role in determining who sits on what committees and who is the chair of which committees. And in the Senate, of course, the presiding officer is Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. And those very important state leaders are going to be determining the overall layout of the Texas Legislature. And certain things are hardwired into the calendar. But basically, in my experience, now everybody has their own pet legislation to look after. But in my experience, the most important employment-related legislation and workforce-related legislation never sees much traction until about March, late March. And then it starts picking up some steam in April. And basically, if a bill hasn't made much of a movement through the first house in which it was filed by April, it may be in trouble unless something happens to intervene. In May, usually that's when you start seeing the winners sorted out from the losers. I keep track of the movement of all of the bills in that legislative tracking file. So if you want, an exact report on the status of any of those bills, just let me know, and I'll send you my latest copy of those bills. But in any event, all the bills have to be completed and passed by sine die. The last day of May of 2023, and if they don't make it then, they're completely dead. The bills that have passed both houses of the legislature get to go before the governor for signing, and the governor has only until mid-June to sign or veto the bills. And I always have a last day report card from the legislature showing all the final status of all of the bills, and I always color code them: green for bills that were signed by the governor, blue for bills that made it through one house, a certain coding for bills that were vetoed by the governor. That doesn't happen very often. And then bills that are highlighted in pink only passed one chamber, but they did not pass both chambers. So that's a very quick and dirty rundown of the schedule.
That's great. Well, yeah, and it's so much. And I think the one thing, Matt, that Tommy didn't mention a lot about is, don't most bills die in committee? They get filed, they get assigned to a committee, and then what's that process like? And how do we, if there's a bill that we're concerned about, or the positive or negatively, is the committee really where we need to be as employers or representatives, employers be focusing?
Yeah, I think the committee process is a great place. That's where the most intense vetting of bills is going to be. You'll be able to provide testimony, both written and in person. And to your point, there's usually about 6,000 to 6,500 bills filed between the House and the Senate each session, and only about 1,000 or 1,200 get signed into law or passed into law. So a vast majority of bills are going to not make it to the end. Only about 20% pass through.
So now you two have very different roles. Tommy, what does the Texas Workforce Commission do? And in your role as legal advisor to the commissioner, what do you've kind of talked about your normal your job during the legislative session, but what's your regular role the rest of the year and a half that the sessions between sessions?
Well, I have a number of job duties, Mike, and one of them, of course, every session I track all the legislation, and then I write reports about the legislation, and I usually get invited by some employer groups to give talks about important legislation. But in addition to that, I advise the commissioner on the final level appeals in unemployment and wage claim and employment discrimination and tax coverage cases, unemployment tax coverage cases that go before the commission. And then another major thing that I do is keep the book updated every year, the book that is called Texas Guidebook for Employers, subtitled especially for Texas employers. We have a print version that's given out to all the attendees at our conferences, but there is a version that is online. It's the total book is online, completely free, 24/7. If you have an internet connection, you can access the book and you can make a copy of it, print it out. There's also a PDF downloadable version that you can do if you like a PDF. And so that's another thing that
I'm gonna in the show notes, I'm gonna include a link to that because in my consulting and stuff, I bet I'm in that 3 or 4 times a month. Just, an employer will ask me a question, something weird about the Texas payday law or something, and I'll have to go dig it out to try to figure out exactly because I know if I can trust Tommy's take on whatever the law is. So I always double check on that.
And then another major thing I do is answer employer emails. And the great thing about email is that I can include links and attachments and things like that in a reply to kind of increase the value of a reply. And then I answer I'm one of the 4 attorneys in Commissioner Demerson's office who answer the 800 number hotline for employers, the 800-832-9394 employer hotline. And then we put on conferences around the state and help other independent business associations, including TAB. Sometimes if they invite us to speak, we will have a speaker available. Sometimes I do it, sometimes one of the other attorneys. But in any event, we enjoy doing the employer outreach like that because it's a way to not only keep our ear to the ground and keep a foot in the real world, but also, we're all true believers in this office, Mike, about the fact that, employers who pay 100% of the taxes for the entire system, they deserve more of a return on their tax dollar than just being regulated. And so we like to, give them some items of real value, including the information that we're talking about.
And Matt, you're on the advocacy side. You're one of those evil lobbyists, but you're lobbying to keep Texas the best place in the world to do business. So what does the session look like for you as a lobbyist?
I'm the lowest rung, though, of evil lobbyists, as you said, as you mentioned, since I'm advocating on behalf of businesses. We have over 1,500 member companies that are part of TAB and over 200 chambers of commerce, local chambers of commerce in Texas. And so we provide testimony at the legislature for or against legislation, sometimes neutral, and try to bring that perspective during the committee hearing process, and then also during that 140-day period to try to either push legislation that's going to make Texas more business friendly or oppose or modify legislation to maintain our current set of regulations that we have that are friendly to businesses.
And TAB has a really amazing advocacy team. But so y'all are showing up to testify and to talk to staff and legislators about issues. How important is it that businesses actually show up to committee hearings or to testify, things like that? Is that really going to make a difference?
Absolutely. And I know that making it down on a short notice, because bills are usually only posted about 5 or 6 days in advance, it is difficult for a lot of folks in Texas. So making it down obviously is the best way to do it in person and see your legislator face to face. But even writing them an email or calling into their office just to make sure that they know that their constituents are concerned about certain policies and want them to vote a certain way. That's very important information for them to have. Usually most elected officials, when a bill is on the floor or in committee, they have a book that's put together from their staff. And in that book is usually little notes of XYZ company in our district supports this or opposes this. So those do make a difference, and elected officials take note of that.
Great. Yeah. And I've been on those calls where, hey, your bill that you've expressed so much concern about, Coffey, is going to be heard Friday. Can you be here? And I'm changing. And last session, one of my pet bills, I testified, I think, twice on it, and it looked really good. And then it got to calendars committee in the last week of the session, and never got calendared for a vote, and died a horrible death. And so you can invest a lot of time, but even though there are good bills that I really want to advocate for, sometimes it's all the bills that die that I'm usually most grateful for, because there's a lot of bad ideas that get introduced during the session.
Yeah, and as I said before, we have a very favorable environment for employers right now in Texas. So a lot of the work that we do in this area is playing defense and making sure that we can continue to attract businesses to Texas and have them thrive here, as we've done for the past 5, 10, 15 years.
So speaking about that, one of the big issues about attracting businesses to Texas was Chapter 330, 313. Talk about what happened to those provisions and what you think. I wasn't planning on this, but I think this is important for business leaders to hear. What do you think is going to happen this session around those incentive programs?
So the Chapter 313 program is a temporary tax abatement economic development tool to bring capital investment into Texas. And it's been very successful in bringing large scale, we're talking multiple billions of dollars in each project invested in Texas. It unfortunately it had a sunset date in the legislation, so meaning that it expired at a certain date, which was, I believe, just a couple months ago. And so it is no longer active and on the books. All the existing applications and everything are still being processed, but nobody can go forward in 2023 without new legislation coming and passing. And so one of our major priorities at TAB is some type of program to take its place, where we're providing a mechanism to incentivize companies to come to Texas, invest billions of dollars, and pay millions and millions and billions of dollars in tax revenue. That's ultimately the goal of these economic development programs. And we want to ensure that there's transparency and items in place to make sure that this is a worthwhile program.
That those tax incentives are well spent and are really getting returned back to the community and jobs and quality of life and those kinds of issues.
Absolutely. That's a very important to whatever reiteration there is of this program, that is the first step. And then also that we're attracting businesses to continue to come to Texas.
So Tommy, we've got, how many bills did you say have been filed so far?
Oh, well, on the first day, 1,000 or so by my count, and by now it's well over 2,000. And there's continuing to come in. Let's see, the latest bill that I've got on the list, I think, was, filed yesterday. That was HB 1155. Well, it might be only about 16 or 1700, but that's a lot of bills. So about 1,200 bills in the House and a smaller number, about a quarter of that in the Senate. But there are some bills of significant interest in there, showing either issues of, substantial concern to employers, or areas of continuing interest, showing trends in legislative thinking that may not become reality this time, but it's always kind of a predictor of what might come to pass in the future.
Let's talk about some of those. I noticed when I was going through your bill list, there are a lot of bills around, mostly about prohibiting discrimination based on sex orientation and gender identity. We don't have to get into the specifics of all those different bills, but generally, what are those bills trying to accomplish?
The majority of those bills that revolve around gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination and so on, those have been filed by folks who are advocates for LGBT plus QIA rights, and they are trying to incorporate into current Chapter 21 of the Texas Labor Code statutory protection against discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation or similar characteristics. Some are broad spectrum, others are not so broad spectrum, but that's the general trend of things, and quite a lot of those.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 78 and enter the keyword Texas. That's TEXAS. On February 8th, I'll be hosting a webinar entitled Mitigating Bias in the Employee Selection Process. We'll discuss the most common ways bias sneaks into or is baked into the recruitment, interviewing, and selection process, and systemic changes that can help mitigate bias in selecting employees. This free webinar is approved for 1 professional development credit for SHRM certified professionals and 1 hour of general recertification credit for HRCI certified professionals. You can register for this free webinar at imperativeinfo.com. And if you're listening to this podcast after February 8th, you can still watch the recorded webinar on our website for credit for free. And now back to my conversation with Tommy Simmons and Matt Abel. Matt, what do you, looking down the road as a former staffer and somebody who's representing business, what do you see the discussion will be around what will the concerns be, and what will the discussion be around those kind of bills?
I think in a lot of those bills, the devil's really in the detail, and we need to see are these protections already in existence in other law, and we're just kind of creating more mechanisms for lawsuits against employers. It is one kind of concern that we've seen in the past. We definitely just want to take a look and see how the bill's written and how it will impact current law and protections that folks already have.
And I've been a member of TAB for years, and I will say I don't come across TAB members who want to actively discriminate against people. But also as an HR guy, I've had to deal with some situations that were kind of cumbersome in defending an employer against something that was, on its face probably not reasonable, but just the way the law is written and the processes around it don't always make the most sense. Because quite honestly, a lot of our legislators have never signed the back of a check, the front of a check, and have never really had to manage people under the existing laws that are already in place.
And Mike, I'd like to add, just to echo what Matt said, the devil being in the details. a lot of these bills, they have very laudable purposes for things that I think the vast majority of Texas businesses already have follow best practices on, from in terms of employee retention, employee morale, and attracting and keeping major talent, and that's no discrimination. But there are varying degrees of remedies there. And some of the bills, of course, provide an administrative remedy through the Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division under Chapter 21 of the Labor Code, while others provide for like a direct door into the courthouse. And that sometimes means the threat of a trial by jury, and things like that can get pretty unpredictable and costly. And I'm sure Matt has heard from lots of TAB members about the concerns that businesses have about the cost of litigation and hiring defense counsel and so on. So you really have to look at what kind of remedies are being proposed in response to violations. Some are of minor concern. Others would be of more substantial concern.
The other big, that's obviously nationwide and in the political zeitgeist. That's a hot topic. And another one is pay equity. And so I know there are bills in the House and Senate, both around that, and I've seen it across the country. Prohibitions around employers inquiring into candidates' previous wages, salaries, in previous employment, and I see that those bills. You want to talk a little bit, Tommy, about what you think those bills are trying to accomplish?
Well, yes. Just in general, there's one bill that's been filed that would establish a Texas Pay Equity Task Force, and that would be presumably an interim term study of the whole issue with an eye toward bringing more legislation possibly in 2025. But in terms of legislation that would begin impacting employers more or less immediately, or at least on September 1st, the most popular effective date for new legislation this session, there is one House bill and one Senate bill. Basically, they look like companions, identical bill captions relating to unlawful employment practices with respect to compensation and wage history. And this reflects a trend in HR nationwide, of course, to shy away from asking too many detailed questions that could give clues as to not only gender, but also that tend to perpetuate past discrimination in terms of gender, salary scales, and so on. So this is something that most employers now have gotten a lot more circumspect about asking questions relating to prior salary history, or at least preserving that for the final level, not something on the job application necessarily, but maybe something at the interview level or the final screening level. But in the end effect, I think most employers, just following best practices, they subscribe to what's it going to take to attract and keep the best qualified workers.
Right. And I think, employers are often looking at wage history as kind of a gauge of what this person's real level of responsibility was. And it gets you past the issues you've got with title inflation. Everybody's a vice president now, and but you got a vice president making $60,000 and a vice president making $100,000 in different organizations, and you can often get some idea of what their real scope of responsibility was, or at least that's the thinking. But of course, the concern on the other side is that women are being paid less than men. And so if I ask my female employment candidate what she was making and base my offer on, giving her an increase, but maybe not to the same, the top of scale in our organization for that job, I may be, that may be based on unfair treatment at a previous employer. And so that's why they don't want you to do it. I need to do a whole podcast episode around that because there's a deeper dive to really get into what an employer ought to be thinking about. Tommy, TWC handles unemployment compensation. I mean, y'all are the state agency that owns that. I don't think there's anything major so far, but I it's been interesting with COVID and everything over the last couple of years. Employers' responsibilities and how do you respond to an unemployment claim when nobody's in the office or we're all remote and things like that. So, what's the current state, allegedly post COVID with the unemployment compensation system in Texas?
Well, the latest is that we are still in the midst of sorting through a lot of second chance chargeback notice responses that came in as a result of direct commission action that was ordered earlier this year. The chair of the agency, Brian Daniel, and also the employer commissioner, Aaron Demerson, agreed that due to the fact that a substantial number of employers may have felt misled by public statements coming out from various state leaders, including the TWC, on April 1st, 2020, to the effect that, don't worry, there won't be any chargebacks because of pandemic or COVID-19 related claims. They thought that they didn't have to respond to the chargeback notices at all, that they would just automatically get chargeback protection. But it's not that simple. That original press release was in the context of a statement about the federal CARES Act benefits, which would be paid out of federal funds appropriated by Congress and not charged back to any Texas employer. And it wasn't meant to be a detailed guide about how to respond from the standpoint of Texas chargebacks and Texas unemployment tax rates. But, be that as it may, a lot of employers legitimately felt misled. And in view of that, a majority of the commission, the commissioner representing the public and the commissioner representing employers, agreed that employers who did not respond to the original chargeback notices mailed out from the start of the pandemic, early March of 2020, all the way through the end of the year, those employers would get what is essentially a do-over. It would be a second chance chargeback notice, giving them another opportunity to reply and explain the reason why the claimant stopped working for their company before they filed an unemployment claim. And that, of course, is what state law requires the chargeback decision to be based on. And this is an unprecedented step, but it's very important for an employer that receives a notice like that to carefully look at the notice and see if it applies to them. And basically, the notice explains that if you felt misled by public statements in early 2020 and for that reason did not respond to the original chargeback notice, and for that reason you did not respond originally, this is your new opportunity basically to respond and explain the circumstances of the work separation. If so, please sign below and explain the work separation on the back of this form. Now, not every employer can sign that form. It's for people who felt misled and for that reason did not respond. Some employers did not feel misled. They had other reasons for not responding. And sometimes things just got away from them. Sometimes business shutdowns, impossible circumstances. And there are various circumstances, very detailed sets of facts sometimes that can still lead to a favorable determination on the chargeback issue, like we'll ignore the late protest, but now let's look at the reason for the work separation. And if an employer can take advantage of that, it should. So maybe it can't say that they were misled, but maybe they can say that they did respond, but TWC must have lost the notice. Or they tried faxing in dozens of times, but the fax machine always refused their fax. Or they tried calling in to find out about it because they were they were confused, and nobody at TWC picked up. All of those are very easy to understand and believe because we were there. We were fielding all those phone calls and getting a lot of letters from employers who said, y'all never pick up on your phones. What's wrong with your fax machines? Nothing's working there. And that was during the height of the pandemic. So if an employer has some kind of a compelling circumstance like that, it should not give up hope totally. It should still go ahead and respond as soon as possible and explain the circumstances behind the late response and why the claimant stopped working for their company. And there's always a chance that they might get chargeback protection. The worst thing that can happen is TWC says, well, no, sorry, your account will remain charged. But they still have a chance of winning. They'll definitely miss that chance if they don't respond. It's like Wayne Gretzky said about hockey, you miss all the goals that you never take a shot for. So anyway, that's what I think that's important for employers to know about the chargebacks.
So Matt, as part of the advocacy team at TAB, you're guided by TAB's board-approved legislative priorities for the session, right? So we're looking at, these are the things that we as businesses in Texas want to preserve or advocate for. Would you hit some of the high points of the employment-related legislative priorities for this session from the Texas Association of Business?
The employment-related legislative priorities fall under a couple of different banners. I think that the most important one is supporting policies that enhance the ability for employers to freely contract with their employees. So this would bolster Texas and keeping efforts to remain a right-to-work state, and oppose legislation that would erode employment at will as a right for all Texas employers. Those are a couple of the main ones where we're playing defense. We have a very friendly environment here and we want to keep it that way. Yeah,
and another one of the things that affect how we operate as employers, especially employers with multiple locations across the state, another big issue for a couple sessions that we've not quite got across the finish line is preemption. Local rules that relate to, everything from, some sort of, paid sick leave, or other kinds of benefits that employers have to offer. Would you talk a little bit about what TAB hopes to see in the preemption area this session?
Yeah, I think there's been other areas where we've seen, a patchwork of laws, of inconsistent laws around the state by either cities or counties. And the state needs to come in and say, we're just going to have one set of laws so that employers don't have to have 5 different policies for 5 different cities in Texas. And so we have tried in multiple sessions to get something passed and are hoping that this session we can have something on the governor's desk that streamlines the processes for these laws in different localities.
Yeah, we've seen Austin is the only state in Texas that's banned the box. It prohibits employers from considering employment or criminal history before they make an offer. And but there are a dozen flavors of ban the box around the country, and if we had a dozen of those in Texas, and I'm a retailer or just an employer that's got multiple work locations, it makes it really difficult to do business in a state where you've got different rules. Now it might as well be a multi-state employer, right? If I've really got to follow a whole bunch of different sets of rules, and so that preemption's been one of the drums I've been banging on for several sessions with TAB. So we're almost out of time, but you've touched on some of it. Tommy's definitely got the list, but what should employers be doing right now, or business leaders in general be doing right now to be prepared for whatever comes during a legislative session and to stay on top of what's going on? Matt, I know TAB puts out a lot of resources. What'd be a good place to start there?
If they're not already, they can join TAB as a member, and you'll have access to the 14 policy committees we have that provide timely updates. on different sections of law. So there's the employment law, healthcare, or tax laws. And then we also have industry-specific committees like energy, technology, and education. So if you're interested in those specific areas, you can sign up for whatever committee you want inside of TAB, and we provide those updates to our members throughout the session. And then during the 18-month interim, when laws are being implemented and rules are going through the rulemaking process, we provide additional information for our members there.
Thank you. And Tommy, I'm going to definitely put your contact information in the show notes, as well as Matt and TAB's, so that folks who want to reach out and get your lists can do that. And I'll also include a link to the Texas Legislature online website where you can look up the actual text of bills and see them where they are in the process. Anything else, Tommy, that we should share with business leaders about staying on top of things?
Well, yes, definitely. Your best friend is going to be TAB and some of the other industry associations that represent your specific industry. I'd advocate that for any business. There is strength in numbers, and the legislative advocates at TAB are, just over the decades, I've seen them be incredibly effective at maintaining this good business environment that we have in Texas, making sure that it's the best possible place to start and grow a business. And so keep that up, join business associations, stay active with it, develop contacts at those associations, ask them for updates, and also subscribe to any business association newsletters that you can, and just basically keep checking those updates from the legislature as well. That legislative database that you talked about, that's a wonderful thing for finding out the latest bill status, and I use that all the time, as well as a couple of other legislative databases. And so just stay informed.
Yeah, and I will also add that your local chambers of commerce, I'm also on the board of the Fort Worth Chamber, are great resources, and you need things that are, especially things that business conditions that are specific to your area of the state. It's a big state, and what concerns us in Fort Worth may not be the same as Lubbock and or the Valley. So plug into your local chamber and know what's going on there. But I want to thank both you guys for joining me. I know I'll see you both a lot over the session, and but this is really helpful, and hopefully we'll get to do a recap that's a victory lap in July. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for having me.
All right. Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening. You can find previous episodes, show notes, and contact info for our guest at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.